haunting and dramatic things to come. The music that introduced a long-running program here on 3AW called While Melbourne Sleeps. One of the original, producers and compeers of that program is on the air now. Len Major, good evening to you.
Bruce, how are you?
And Len, we've been looking forward to this for a long, long time.
How are you? It's nice to hear from you.
Len, describe for our perhaps younger listeners, what was the basis of While Melbourne Sleeps?
Well, I think the real basis was that there was no Sunday papers in Melbourne, and it was thought that we should have a program which brought to the listener what was happening overnight in Melbourne on a Saturday night, and that's how it started. It started first with Stan Hughes, and then I took over. And it was a case of having a liaison with the police department and the ambulance department, and we covered the crime scene. We also covered Melbourne at midnight, at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I can recall one of the broadcasts I made just walking down Burke Street, and at 3 a.m. in the morning, there wasn't a soul. You could hear the echo of the footsteps, but you could see a few people posting letters and others reading under lamplight.
Of course, in those days, Len, you would have been using a very bulky and heavy tape recorder.
Well, Philip, no, not quite, because we were lucky enough to get what was called a Stancil Hoffman mini tape. It wasn't very big, but it continually broke down, I want to tell you. Prior to that, of course, we had the big wire recorder, which weighed about 80 or 90 pounds.
Were you a journalist then, Len?
Started my career after leaving high school as a cadet journalist, and then went with 12 to 18 months with that background to 2CA Canberra, where I did general announcing as a cadet, basically. And then the Macquarie newsreel, which was broadcast throughout the Macquarie network in each individual state. I did some of the Canberra reports, interviewing with politicians, and that sort of day-to-day activity.
Any memorable interviews? I mean, this is asked a lot, but I'm just trying to tap your memories of names, of leaders of industry and power in those years. Any memorable people jump out at you?
Yes, I suppose you're going to date me a little bit, but I would think, as far as politicians are concerned, both Ben Chifley and Prime Minister Menzies would have in those days been the two highlights. Arthur Caldwell was another. They were certainly Mr. Chifley and Mr. Caldwell would take to the microphone quite easily. That was not the case necessarily with Mr. Menzies. He shied away from radio, and later on I had an experience with him at the White House in Washington when I was in New York. And I remember at GTV, Philip, when he did policy speeches, he usually did his work from GTV in Melbourne, and he hated television.
But why, Len, when he was such a statesman?
Well,
did he shy away from the camera and the microphone?
Was nervous of it. I must say that he was one of the first heads of government to meet John Kennedy, and that was in about the end of January after that had been 1961, and he was very reticent about talking to the press at all. But after luncheon with President Kennedy, it was Kennedy's normal activity is to take his guests around the White House and introduce him to the press corps, which has a separate housing situation on the White House grounds. And he reluctantly met the press, and I want to tell you, within about 10 minutes he had him in the palm of his hand. He was a very great orator.
I'd like to go back to While Melbourne Sleeps for a moment. We haven't pinpointed a date, and I want to ask you what you'd do on a slow news Sunday to pad it out, Len.
Well, you'll be amazed at what you can do. I mean, from going down to the morgue, I know that sounds gruesome, but you can get a story there.
Are we talking, what, mid-50s or early 50s?
Mid-50s.
Yes.
You could also go to the Electricity Commission, find out what was happening as far as the electricity supply was concerned. When was it at its highest? When was it low? What was the difference between summer and winter? To the Weather Bureau. literally there is 1,000,001 stories that you can do, and it somehow makes it a little different if you're interviewing someone at 2 a.m. in the morning.
Len, your association with Jack Davey, was that only through the Red X trials?
Well, I did the Red X trial with Jack. I knew Jack, and also when he came to Melbourne to do the Macquarie shows, I was one of those people that said about 10 words at the beginning and end of each program, if you understand, the introduction.
Of course.
But we did have quite a good deal of association. And we pulled a few stunts. The last one I did was with him in an Austin Healey, which was a fast sports car he had brought in from the United Kingdom and had the Air Force doctor it up a little bit, and we put some 100 octane in it and did a speed test down the road from Albury to Wangaratta at about 140, 150 miles an hour. And that created some furor because we broadcast the result, but we weren't aware of road safety at the time, and we had to withdraw the fact that it was on a highway. We rather gave the inference when it was rebroadcast that it was other than on a highway.
Yeah. Jack Davey, much loved and respected as a radio broadcaster. Did you see another side to him, Len Major?
No, my relationship with Jack was always a very pleasant one. He liked company. He was a man that would give 110% when he went on the air, and he's quite happy to do that to people he worked with as well. He was a charming character.
Len, why did you turn your back on radio in favour of television in the mid-50s?
Well, I think it was 1954, Jim Fisher and Rod Biddle. Rod Biddle later became the chief engineer of GTV, Jim Fisher of the chief engineer of HSV, and Graham Davey, the chief engineer of Channel O, were at the Royal, what was then called the Royal Melbourne Technical College. They were able to secure a television camera which was bought out by the Shell company to show people at the Royal Easter Show what television looked like. And so it was decided that they would run a course, I think you'd call it now an adult education course at night time. And I was interested. There was 12 of us. We got together. It was the blind teaching the blind in many respects, not the electronic side, because Rod and the engineers knew all about it, but as far as production was concerned. And out of that came Chris Muir, Norman Spencer, and Ron Jury, and quite a few other people. And that sort of turned my attention to television. But might I say that there's nothing quite like radio.
No, I couldn't agree more, although you did a lot for those early days of television as an executive and an ideas man, both with the Nine Network and other affiliates.
Yeah, I started with the 7 Network. Then I went to America, where I covered the United Nations and the White House, as we could in those days, because you had tons of time. It wasn't satellite. I can recall the first big aircraft accident, 2 aircraft which collided, unfortunately, over Staten Island, and all people were killed. And we got a film back to Australia in 32 hours, and it was front-page news. Today, you get it back in 32 seconds.
Len, had you chosen a different path, I suppose in the 1990s you could be the Brian Henderson of Sydney or the Brian Naylor of Melbourne, or didn't that appeal to you?
In one sense it did, but in another it didn't. I enjoyed all the aspects. Luckily, when, as you know, Philip, only too well, that when television started you had to be a jack of all trades. And you could go on the air, you could direct a program, you could be a floor manager, and you could be a cameraman, in a sense. Not necessarily expert in each area, but it gave you a great grounding, and as a result of that, I got a very good background to television, and I liked all aspects of it.
What about pay TV? Are you looking forward to that challenge, and will you be involved?
Well, to be involved, I don't know. The challenge, but the pay will inevitably come to Australia.
Do we need it, Len?
Well, I think that there has been a perception, probably promulgated to the viewer, that they're going to get more than what they get now. And I don't think that's the case. certainly Hollywood's not producing anymore, nor are the networks, nor are the cable. It's a bit of the same. The one thing that pay does bring to you is a quicker route from the silver screen, that's from the theatre, to your home. I mean, what happens is the major feature films go first to the theatre, then to pay, then to home video, and then to free television. So that those films that you see now, you will see probably 6 to 9 to 12 months later on free television.
Len, does television in the 90s disappoint you somewhat in its programming and its content?
No, to the degree that there is a sameness about it, to the fact that I think we are changing back. I'm just saying the other day, looking at the top programs, in a sense, we're back to the 70s. I mean, you get holiday programs, 7:30, you get home programs, and all those things, that type of reality television was what we had in the 50s and 60s. And there's a tendency to go back to that. I think television today, however, is changing, particularly in this country, where there's a great emphasis placed on news and news-related programs. And we are one of the few countries in the world where in the top 10 programs, about 60% or 70% are news or news-oriented.
Len, we've talked about your radio days. We've talked about what you've contributed to Australian television over the last 35 years. The fact that you're with Australian Consolidated Press these days, does this mean that you've turned towards the print media?
No, that's just where my office is. It's at the headquarters of the Consolidated Press of the Packer organisation.
So you're still in there, aren't you?
Yes, yeah, that's where that's purely, I have nothing to do with the press side of it at all.
And Len, is your daughter still in television?
No, she followed, in a sense, her desire to get into television, and she was for some time with the Simon Townsend's Wonder World.
That's right.
Then went to Brisbane on a current affairs type program, came back and did a bit of acting, and decided that this wasn't really for her. She went back to what she was trained for. She graduated with a diploma of education and a master in child psychology, so she's teaching.
Well, Len, I know you still have relatives in Melbourne because a favourite auntie of yours has asked me so often, she bails me up and says, when are you going to talk to Len Major on Remember When?
Well, that's very nice of her, but the last time I spoke over my favourite radio station was with Tony Charlton. We had a similar career at 3AW. They were halcyon days, the days of Norman Banks and John Masters and Rex Walden, Jim Wood, Val Colburn, and need I go on.
Well, next time you're in town, we'd love you to pop into the old address, although it's a different building. The spirits are still around.
Are they really?
Yes.
It seems, Len Major, you've had the best of both worlds, the best of radio, now the best of television.
Well, Philip, it's nice to be able to speak to both you and Bruce. I haven't seen you for a few years. I think that we used to see each other quite regularly, at least Philip and myself. We'd meet in airports somehow.
Yes, we did, Len, but, I'm more of a homebody these days. I'm not as young as I was, Len.
Oh, go on with
Len, thanks for being with us. Shades there and memories of Len Major as the man behind the microphone in While Melbourne Sleeps.